Sarah Hart was not carrying a child born of love. She was carrying the living proof of her father's delusion. Daniel Hart had fallen into the grip of a desert preacher's whispers. He became convinced that only his own blood could make a sacred ritual pure. To him, Sarah wasn't his daughter anymore. She was a vessel, locked away like livestock, condemned to a nightmare no woman should ever endure. Her cries shook the walls each night. Yet every morning the cult women wiped the floors as if pain could be scrubbed away. By 6 months pregnant, Sarah no longer pleaded for mercy. She prayed only for one thing: escape. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. This story gets much more intense, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. The Utah sun was brutal, and the sandstone cliffs rose around her like watchtowers. One night, when the guards stumbled drunk on cheap whiskey, she slipped through a broken corral fence. Her thin dress hung in tatters, her swollen belly slowing every step. Her bare feet tore open on sharp stone, her breath came in ragged gasps, and every sob threatened to break her body in two. Dogs barked in the distance, and behind her the flicker of torches licked the night air. But she kept running. She ran until her vision blurred white. She ran until the world tilted sideways. When she fell, she clutched her stomach as if her hands could shield the child inside. A whisper escaped her lips, cracked and weak. "It hurts inside, too." That was when the sound of hooves broke the silence. A horse's shadow loomed across the moonlit dirt. Boots pressed into the dry grass. William McGraw was a rancher who had lived 53 years with more ghosts than friends. He had buried his wife a decade earlier, and since then spoke more to the land than to people. Nothing in those years had prepared him for what he found that night. A young woman lay collapsed at his fence line. Blood streaked her thighs. Her hair stuck to her tear-soaked face. Her eyes fought to stay open, but the weight of pain pulled her under. Will dropped to one knee. His rough hands brushed aside the torn fabric to find the source of her wound. And then he froze. On the curve of her stomach, a symbol had been carved deep into her flesh. It was no accident. It was the mark of a blade, the work of someone who believed in madness more than God. The girl moaned, the same broken words again. "It hurts inside, too." Will lifted her into his arms. The desert wind carried only silence. But silence in the West was never to be trusted. Somewhere out there, a father was hunting his daughter. And when that man came, how far would he go to take her back? Will carried Sarah into his cabin. The floorboards creaked under his boots as he set her down on the only bed he had. Her skin was pale, lips cracked, breath shallow. For a moment, he thought she might not survive the night. He fetched water, cleaned her wounds, and wrapped her belly with strips of cloth. The carved mark twisted his stomach. He had branded cattle in his time, but never had he seen such cruelty carved into a human body, let alone by a father. In her sleep, Sarah's hand reached out, gripping his wrist like a drowning soul clinging to a rope. Her eyes flickered open, filled with fear, but also a flicker of something else: hope. Her voice was raw, ashamed to speak the truth. "My father did this." Daniel Hart. Will froze. He knew that name. Everyone in Escalante knew it. Daniel had once been a respected rancher before falling under the sway of a preacher who claimed to hear God in the desert wind. Will shook his head. He could not believe a man would wound his own daughter like livestock. But Sarah's voice stayed steady. He said, "My child would be born pure, because it is both his seed and his blood." He said the ritual would bring rain back to the valley. Her eyes burned, though tears fell down her cheeks. He gave up his soul for a storm that never came. Will sat back, the firelight flickering across her face. This wasn't just a runaway. This was a girl hunted by her own father, carrying a child cursed by obsession. And yet in her eyes, he saw something he had not seen in years: a spark, a reason to stand tall again. Sarah closed her eyes, still clutching his hand, as if the night itself might try to swallow her whole. The cabin grew quiet, the fire cracking softly in the corner. But Will knew that quiet wouldn't last. If Daniel believed the ritual truly needed her, it was only a matter of time before someone came knocking. The night outside was still, too still. Will sat in the old wooden chair by the fire, his rifle leaning against the wall within arm's reach. The flames flickered across Sarah's face, catching the shine of her tears even in sleep. He had seen cattle storms, droughts, and death, but this was something darker. A girl torn apart not just by strangers, but by her own blood. He couldn't shake the question that sat heavy in his chest. What kind of father does this to his daughter? He knew Daniel Hart. Everyone in town once tipped their hat to him. He had been a man of land and laughter, a hard drinker, but a good worker. Somewhere between drought and desert sermons, something broke inside him. Now his daughter lay branded and hunted like property. Sarah stirred on the bed, whispering words that cracked like glass. "He'll come for me." Her hand reached out, clutching his sleeve with a desperate grip. "Please don't let him take me back." Will placed his hand over hers, rough palm against trembling fingers. "You're safe here," he said. But even as he spoke, he knew safety was a fragile promise. The wind picked up outside, brushing dry grass against the cabin walls. In the desert, silence wasn't peace. It was a warning. Hours passed slow. Will sat with his thoughts, listening to her uneven breaths. He thought about the years he had wasted in quiet, speaking only to the land after his wife died. He had believed nothing could stir his heart again. But this girl, this broken, scarred girl, was asking him to stand between her and the world. And he knew deep down he couldn't walk away. When the first knock came, it wasn't loud. Just a fist brushing with like someone testing his resolve. Will stood, rifle in hand, and eased the door open. A lone rider waited at the edge of the porch, his horse restless in the night air. The stranger's face caught the moonlight, eyes sharp and hungry. He didn't smile. He smirked like a man who already believed the fight was won. "She belongs to us," the stranger said, voice low. "Hand her over, and no blood has to be spilled." Will leveled his rifle, steady as stone. Not a chance. The man tilted his head, still smirking, though the look in his eyes hardened. His hand brushed the reins, the horse stamping in the dirt. "You tell Daniel this," Will said, his voice carrying across the porch. "If he wants her, he'll have to walk through me first." For a beat, the desert held its breath. Then the rider's smirk flickered into something colder. He swung back into the saddle, the leather creaking under his weight. "This ain't over," he said, before turning his horse. The sound of hooves thundered across the plain until it faded into silence again. Inside, Sarah had pulled herself up to the doorway, clutching her stomach. Her face was pale, eyes wide with fear. "They'll come back," she whispered. "And next time, they won't be alone." Will lowered his rifle, but his heart didn't rest. She was right. This wasn't over. The silence outside was only the pause before a storm. That night, Will sat awake by the fire, rifle across his lap, listening for the sound of hooves. He had lived half his life trying to stay out of other people's battles. But now he found himself caught in one. Not because he went looking for it, but because a girl too broken to stand had placed her trust in him. He looked at her sleeping form, curled tight like she was trying to hold herself together. And something inside him shifted. It wasn't just duty anymore. It was something stronger, something he hadn't let himself feel in years. The pull to protect, to fight, to matter again. The night dragged on, but Will stayed awake. He knew what was coming. And when the dawn broke, the desert wouldn't be quiet anymore. The desert sky turned gray before dawn, streaks of light crawling over the cliffs. Will hadn't slept a wink. His rifle sat across his knees, and every creak of the cabin felt like a warning. Sarah rested in the next room, though rested wasn't the right word. She tossed and turned, her hand often clutching her swollen belly as if trying to calm the life inside. Then came a sound Will had been waiting for. Hooves. Not one this time. Several. The ground trembled faintly, a rumble that grew louder until it pressed against the walls of the cabin. Will stood, jaw tight, and stepped outside. 3 riders appeared at the edge of the ranch, their shapes cut sharp against the rising sun. One dismounted slowly, moving with the confidence of a man who believed the land belonged to him. Will didn't need to see his face to know who it was. He knew by the way his stomach clenched, the way his breath caught. Daniel Hart. He looked older, the desert having carved lines into his face, but his eyes were alive with something fierce, something that twisted grief into madness. He wasn't alone. 2 hired guns flanked him, rough men with twitching hands that hovered near their pistols. Will stepped onto the dirt, rifle leveled. His voice carried, calm but sharp. Best turn around. Daniel's jaw worked as he stared at Will. His voice came out raw. She's mine. That girl belongs to me. Will's grip tightened on the rifle. She's not property. Not yours, not anyone's. The tension cracked like dry wood. One of the hired guns drew his weapon, fast, but what was faster. The rifle boomed, and the man tumbled into the dust. The other rushed forward, gun raised, but Will's next shot caught him in the chest, throwing him back with a scream that died before it left his lips. Smoke hung heavy in the morning air. Will staggered as a bullet grazed his shoulder, hot pain slicing through his shirt. Blood seeped into the fabric, but he kept his aim locked on Daniel. The old rancher stood frozen, staring down the barrel. His chest rose and fell, breath ragged. For a moment, Will thought it might end there, one pull of the trigger, and the madness would be silenced forever. Then came a sound behind him, bare feet on the porch. Sarah stumbled into view, one hand on the doorframe, the other clutching her stomach. Her voice cracked, breaking against the still air. Please don't kill him. He's still my father. Will's finger twitched on the trigger. He could end this right now, and the threat in the hunt. But Sarah's words held him back. He slowly lowered the rifle. Daniel's face twisted. Rage burned there, but something else flickered too. Sorrow, maybe even pity. He looked at his daughter, and for a heartbeat his eyes softened. Then the fire returned. His voice dropped bitter. Another girl will take your place. With that, he swung back into the saddle. His horse reared, then turned toward the horizon. Dust rose behind him, carrying his shadow into the distance. Sarah crumpled to her knees on the porch, tears streaking her face. Will pressed his hand against his bleeding shoulder, body shaking but resolve hardening. Daniel had walked away, but his words clung like smoke. He wasn't finished. He would never be finished. The desert grew quiet again, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that brought peace. It was the kind that carried questions. How long before Daniel came back? How far would a father's madness go? And could Will protect Sarah and the unborn child when the next storm rolled in? Sarah sat curled against the porch, whispering through her sobs. I thought I saved him, but maybe I only gave him more time. Will didn't answer. His shoulder burned, blood soaking through his shirt, but he stood tall. He knew the truth she couldn't bear to say out loud. Daniel Hart wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The first rays of the sun spilled across the ranch, turning the dry ground gold. For a brief moment, it looked almost peaceful, but Will knew better. The fight had only begun. The gun smoke lingered long after Daniel rode away, drifting across the yard until it mixed with the dry morning air. Will stood with his rifle still raised, his arm trembling from blood loss, but it wasn't the wound that made his chest heavy. It was Sarah, on her knees at the porch, her tears falling silently onto the wooden boards. For the first time in years, Will wished words came easier to him, but his mouth stayed shut. He lowered the rifle and pressed his palm to his shoulder, blood slipping hot between his fingers. Sarah lifted her face, her eyes swollen from crying. You should have killed him, she whispered, her voice breaking. You would have saved us both. Will crouched beside her, wincing at the pain shooting through his arm. You didn't want that, he said quietly. I didn't want him to hurt me, she answered, her voice shaking. But he's still my father. I thought maybe somewhere inside, he still loved me. Her lip trembled. And now he's gone, planning the next girl. Another child. Will swallowed hard. He'd seen good men turn sour from drink or debt, but Daniel Hart was different. He wasn't just broken. He was convinced that his cruelty was holy. That made him dangerous in a way bullets alone couldn't fix. Sarah, Will said slowly, the only thing you did today was show you still have a heart. That's not weakness. That's what keeps you different from him. Her hand pressed to her belly, trembling fingers spreading across the cloth that wrapped the carved wound. She shook her head. This baby, it's a seed, his blood. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be able to look at it without seeing him. Will hesitated. He wasn't a man who spoke much about hope. He had buried too many pieces of it with his wife. But looking at Sarah, so young and so torn apart, something inside him stirred. "You'll see more than him," he said softly. "You'll see yourself. And maybe you'll see the part of life that he'll never be able to touch." Her tears slipped faster at that, not from fear, but from the ache of wanting to believe. She leaned against him, her head pressing to his chest. For the first time since she stumbled onto his land, she let herself rest. The hours after the fight stretched heavy. Will stitched his shoulder with rough hands, biting down on a strip of leather to keep quiet. Sarah watched, guilt etched across her face. "You bled because of me," she said. "I've bled for less," he muttered, tying the knot. By late afternoon, the ranch looked almost ordinary again. Smoke had cleared, the dead were gone, and the sun burned down as if nothing had happened. But the silence was heavy. Sarah helped sweep the porch, her movements slow from her swollen belly. She wanted to work, wanted to feel useful, but every time her hands trembled, Will caught it. "You don't have to," he said, watching her brush dirt into the dust. "If I sit still, I'll go mad," she answered. "The more I move, the more it feels like I'm alive. Not just waiting to be hunted." Will nodded. He knew that feeling well. After his wife passed, he worked the land until his body broke, just to remind himself he still existed. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Will found her sitting by the fire, staring into the flames with her knees pulled close. Her face glowed in the orange light, fragile but fierce. "He carved me," she said suddenly, her voice flat, like I was a calf to be marked. "Every time I close my eyes, I feel the knife again. Sometimes I think I'll never be clean, no matter how much I wash." Will's chest tightened. He had branded animals his whole life, and the thought of a man pressing steel into his own daughter's flesh turned his stomach. He knelt beside her, his rough hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Scars don't decide who you are," he said. "They just tell people what you've been through. And you've been through hell. But you're still here. That means something." She blinked hard, her breath catching. "Why are you helping me? You could have left me there in the dirt. Why carry me inside? Why stay?" Will sat back, his gaze settling on the fire. For years, he had believed his life was over, that the best parts of it were buried under the ground beside his wife. But when Sarah had looked at him with those desperate, hopeful eyes, something cracked open in him. Something he thought was gone forever. "Because," he said finally, his voice rough, "I couldn't walk away. Not from you." Sarah didn't answer. She leaned her head against his arm, tears still streaking her face, but her body loosening for the first time, as if she finally believed she wasn't alone. Outside, the desert was quiet again, the kind of quiet that didn't last. The stars stretched endless overhead, and the night carried the weight of what Will already knew. Daniel Hart wasn't finished. He would come again, and when he did, the fight would demand more than rifles and blood. It would demand the strength to choose, not just survival, but what kind of people they would be after the storm. Days passed, though neither Will nor Sarah counted them. The fight with Daniel's men left the ranch scarred. A hole in the porch where bullets had splintered the wood, bloodstains in the dirt that no amount of sweeping could hide. But life had a way of pushing forward. Will fixed fences, split firewood, and fed the animals, while Sarah tried to tend a small garden behind the cabin. Her belly grew heavier, and every step looked harder, but she kept moving. She said she needed to feel like she was building something, not just hiding. At night, when the desert grew too quiet, Sarah woke with gasps that turned into sobs. Will often found her by the window, staring out at the dark horizon as if expecting torches to appear at any moment. Sometimes she whispered to herself, words so soft he could barely hear. "Don't find me. Don't find me." One night, he brought her a blanket and draped it over her shoulders. She jumped at his touch, then breathed out slowly when she realized it was him. "I can't stop hearing him," she said, her voice shaking. "When he carved me, he said I was chosen, that the blood inside me wasn't mine anymore. Sometimes I feel like he's still here, whispering in my ear." Will crouched beside her, his hand resting gently on her arm. "He isn't here," he said. "Not anymore. You're with me now, and I won't let him near you." Her eyes filled with tears, but for the first time in days she nodded, as if some part of her wanted to believe him. The next morning, Will's shoulder ached from the bullet wound. Sarah caught him trying to lift a heavy bucket, and she rushed forward. "You shouldn't be doing that," she scolded softly. She tried to take it from him, but the weight was too much for her. They both laughed, the sound awkward but real. It was the first laugh either of them had heard since blood spilled on the porch. As the weeks stretched, the ranch started to change. It was still quiet, still lonely, but no longer felt like just Will's burden to carry. Sarah's hands planted seeds, pulled weeds, and scrubbed dishes in the small kitchen. Will patched the roof and repair the corral. They moved in rhythm, two broken people piecing together something that almost looked like life. One evening, Sarah sat by the fire, her hands resting on her stomach. "Do you ever think about leaving here?" she asked. Will shook his head. "This land's in my blood. Every fence post, every stone, it's all I've got left." She stared at the flames. "I used to dream about leaving. Anywhere else. Just being free. But now," her voice softened, "now I just want a place where no one finds us." "You've got that here," Will said. His tone was firm, but inside he wasn't so sure. He knew Daniel. A man who believed God himself whispered to him wouldn't stop until his madness burned out or killed him. The baby came sooner than either of them expected. One cold night, Sarah clutched her belly and cried out, her face pale with pain. Will panicked at first. He hadn't delivered anything but calves, but he did what he knew. Stayed steady, stayed near, didn't let her feel alone. Hours dragged on, her screams filling the cabin, echoing against the walls. And then, just as the fire burned low, a new cry broke through the night. A baby girl, small, fragile, her tiny fists waving in the air as she wailed. Sarah sobbed, her whole body shaking, but the sound in her voice had changed. It wasn't fear. It was relief. She pulled the child against her chest, tears running down her face. "Hope," she whispered. "Her name is Hope." Will watched, his rough hands trembling as Sarah handed the baby to him. The child's fingers curled around his thumb, impossibly small yet gripping tight. For a man who thought life had passed him by, who believed he'd already buried every piece of love he'd ever have, something inside him cracked open. Sarah leaned back, exhausted but smiling through her tears. "It doesn't hurt inside anymore," she whispered. Will looked down at the baby, then at her. And for the first time in years, he believed it. The desert outside was still. But for them, inside that small cabin, something had finally come alive. Hope's cry filled the cabin that night, and for once the sound of life overpowered the fear of death. Sarah cradled her daughter close, rocking her gently, her tears falling onto the newborn's soft hair. Will sat nearby, too afraid to move, as if the smallest sound would break the fragile miracle before him. His big, calloused hands trembled when Sarah placed the baby in his arms again. He held her like she was made of glass, staring at the tiny fingers gripping his thumb. "She's perfect," Sarah whispered, her voice full of awe and disbelief. "After everything, she's still perfect." Will's throat tightened. He wanted to say something, but words never came easy to him. Instead, he looked at Sarah, then back at the child and nodded. That nod carried more meaning than most men could speak in a lifetime. The days that followed were not easy. Hope cried through the nights, waking Sarah from what little rest she managed to steal. Her body was sore, her face pale, but every time she looked at her baby, something softer filled her eyes. She sang quiet lullabies, broken melodies she remembered from her own childhood. Sometimes she cried while singing them, the memories too sharp, but she never stopped. Will worked harder than ever. He chopped wood with one arm, the other still stiff from his wound. He cooked meals awkwardly, the way a man does when he never had reason to learn. Sarah teased him once when the bread came out black, but her laugh turned into tears halfway through. Will didn't tease back. He just sat beside her, letting her lean against him until she stopped shaking. The ranch became more than shelter. It became a place where both of them, broken in their own ways, started to stitch their lives back together. Sarah planted vegetables in the small patch of soil behind the cabin. She whispered to them the same way she whispered to her child, as though life could be coaxed into growing with love alone. Will built a small cradle from spare wood, carving it late into the night when he couldn't sleep. His rough hands weren't steady enough to make it pretty, but when Sarah laid hope in it, she smiled as though it was the most beautiful thing in the world. But peace never came without shadows. Some nights, Sarah woke screaming, clutching her stomach where the scar still burned. Will would rush in, his heart racing, and find her shaking, whispering, "He's coming. I know he's coming." Will didn't lie to her. He never said Daniel was gone for good, because both of them knew better. Instead, he held her hand and said, "If he does, he'll have to go through me first." Sarah often stared at Hope while she slept, her face torn between love and sorrow. "What if she looks like him?" she whispered once. "What if every time I see her, I see his face staring back?" Will leaned close, his voice low. "Then you look again. Because she isn't him. She's you. And she's this place. And she's the chance to make something better than what came before." Sarah cried into her hands after that. But when she looked at her baby again, her eyes were softer. Weeks turned into months. The seasons shifted, though the desert changed little. Each sunrise felt like stolen time, each night a test of nerves. Daniel's threat still hung over them like a storm cloud. Every sound of hooves in the distance made Will reach for his rifle. Every stranger passing the ranch made Sarah hold hope a little tighter. But in the quiet spaces between fear, something real grew. Sarah's laugh returned, shy at first, then stronger. Will found himself talking more, telling her small stories about his younger days. How his wife once painted the cabin door blue because she hated the way Plain would look against the dust, or how he nearly drowned as a boy chasing a calf across a river. Sarah listened as if these small stories were lifelines, something to remind her that not all memories carried pain. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Sarah sat on the porch with Hope asleep against her chest. She looked at Will as he stacked wood, his movements slow but steady. "You saved me," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Will paused, leaning on the axe handle, his brow furrowing. "I just did what any man should have done." "No," she said firmly. "Most men would have turned away. You didn't. You gave me a home when I didn't even believe I deserved one." Will looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. For years he had lived as though his life was already over, as though love and purpose had been buried with his wife. But standing there, with Sarah's eyes meeting his and Hope's soft breath filling the air, he realized something he hadn't let himself admit until now. He wasn't done. Not yet. And for the first time in a long time, the thought of tomorrow didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a promise. The months that followed gave Sarah and Will a fragile rhythm, like a song that could break at any moment but still carried them forward. Hope grew stronger, her cries sharper, her tiny fists clenching with life. Sarah's body healed slowly, though the scar on her stomach never let her forget. Some days she traced it with her fingers, silent tears sliding down her cheeks, while Hope nursed at her breast. Other days, she held her daughter up to the window, whispering, "You're not him. You'll never be him. You're mine." Will watched quietly, always nearby, but never crowding her. He knew when to offer his rough hand, and when to let her find her own strength. He had learned long ago that healing wasn't something a man could force. It came in its own time, in its own way. The ranch began to look different, though no stranger would have noticed. A cradle sat near the fire, rocking gently when Hope fussed. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, Sarah's touch softening the cabin in ways Will hadn't imagined possible. And laughter, real laughter, returned, though always in small bursts. Once, Sarah spilled a whole bucket of water over Will's boots, and he stood there cursing softly while she bent over laughing until she couldn't breathe. For a moment, it felt like the past had loosened its grip, but fear never disappeared. It lived in the corners of their minds, heavy as the desert heat. Every sound of hoofbeats carried the question neither of them spoke aloud. Is it him? Will's rifle was always within reach. At night, he sat awake more often than he slept, eyes fixed on the door. One evening, Sarah sat on the porch, cradling Hope, watching the horizon bleed red with sunset. Will joined her, lowering himself into the creaking chair beside her. For a long while they said nothing. Then Sarah spoke, her voice soft but firm. I dream about him, she admitted. About the way his eyes looked that day. It's like he's burned into me, the way the scar is. Sometimes I wake up and I can still feel his hand holding me down. Will clenched his jaw, the muscles in his face tightening. He wanted to tell her she didn't have to remember, that she could just forget. But he knew better. Forgetting wasn't possible. Surviving meant carrying the memory and still choosing to live anyway. You're not there anymore, he said instead. You're here, with me, with her, and that's what matters now. Sarah looked at him, her eyes glassy but steady. Why do you stay? She asked. Why take on my fight? My pain? You didn't have to. Will leaned back, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Maybe I needed it, he said honestly. For years, I lived like I was already buried. Woke up, worked the land, went to bed. Nothing more. Then you came, and suddenly, I had a reason to pick up my rifle again. A reason to care if tomorrow came. Her breath hitched, and she looked down at Hope's sleeping face. So we saved each other? Will turned his head, his weathered eyes meeting hers. I reckon so. The word sat between them, heavy but warm. For a long while, the only sound was the wind brushing the dry grass, the faint coo of the baby in Sarah's arms. But deep down, Will knew peace couldn't last forever. Daniel Hart hadn't given up. Men like him didn't just disappear into the dust. Somewhere out there, he was waiting, plotting, feeding his madness. And when he came again, because Will was certain he would, the fight would be worse than before. Still, as he watched Sarah hum softly to her daughter, as he saw the way her eyes softened when hope curled against her chest, he felt something stronger than fear. It was the quiet knowledge that some things were worth bleeding for, worth dying for, if it came to that. Inside the cabin, the fire flickered against the walls, throwing shadows that danced across the floor. Hope stirred and let out a sharp cry, and Sarah rocked her gently, whispering, "Shoo, you're safe. You're safe." Will sat back, listening to her words. He let them sink into him too, as if she wasn't just speaking to the child but to both of them. Safe. For tonight, at least. And sometimes a single night of safety was enough to keep hope alive. The seasons shifted again. The desert did not change much. The cliffs still stood like watchtowers, the air still carried the sting of dust, and silence still pressed heavy at night. But inside the cabin, life was different. Hope had grown into a strong, bright-eyed child, her tiny laugh ringing through the rooms that once echoed only with sorrow. Sarah's body had healed more, though the scar across her stomach never faded. Some days she hated it. Other days, she touched it softly, reminding herself that pain had led to something beautiful. Will worked the land as he always had, but now there was laughter mixed into the rhythm of chores. Sarah would stand in the doorway with Hope on her hip, calling out for him to wash his hands before touching the baby. He'd grumble, pretending to be annoyed, but the truth was he cherished the sound of her voice, a sound that carried more life than silence ever could. But shadows lingered at the edges of peace. Daniel Hart never returned, though his absence was a ghost of its own. Some nights, Sarah jolted awake, convinced she had heard his boots on the porch, his voice outside the window. Each time, Will would sit up beside her, steady hand on her back, whispering, "It's just the wind." She would cry softly, and he would hold her until her breathing evened out. One evening, after Hope had fallen asleep, Sarah sat by the fire, her eyes distant. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Why hasn't he come back? A man like him doesn't just give up." Will stared into the flames. Maybe he finally broke. Maybe he found another place to pour his madness. Or maybe, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Maybe the fight you gave him on that porch, the way you stood there, scarred but unbroken, maybe that was enough to shake him. Sarah frowned, tears brimming. But what if it wasn't? What if one day he shows up again, and Hope grows up knowing the same fear I lived with? Will leaned forward, his voice steady. Then we face it together. But you can't live tomorrow's fight before it comes. You've already lived through enough. Now it's time to live for her. He nodded toward the sleeping child in the cradle. Sarah followed his gaze, her tears spilling but her lips curving into a soft, broken smile. She deserves better than the world I was born into. She already has it, Will said. She has you. And she has a mother who chose hope instead of despair. The room grew quiet, the only sound the crackle of firewood. Sarah reached across the table, her hand brushing against his. It was a simple touch, but one that carried more weight than words. For years, Will had believed he was finished, that his life had nothing left to give. Yet in that moment, with Sarah's hand in his and Hope's gentle breath filling the silence, he realized he had been wrong. Life hadn't ended with loss. It had begun again with love. The days turned into years, and though fear never vanished completely, it became smaller, weaker, something that no longer ruled them. Sarah's laughter grew freer. Will's voice grew steadier. And Hope, fittingly named, grew up never knowing the chains her grandfather once tried to bind them with. The desert still tested them with drought and storms, but now it also witnessed something stronger than survival. It bore witness to a family built not by blood, but by choice. And that was the truth they carried forward. That family is not always the one we are born into, but sometimes the one we build when broken souls choose to stand together. Sarah once whispered to Will, years later, as they watched Hope chase the sunlight outside, "It doesn't hurt inside anymore." Will nodded, his chest full, his weathered face soft in the glow of dusk. "That's because you turned pain into something stronger. You turned it into love." The desert, harsh and unforgiving, had not changed. But they had. And maybe that was the lesson worth holding on to. No matter how deep the scars, no matter how cruel the past, hope could still grow in the hardest soil. Because love, when chosen against all odds, was stronger than blood, stronger than fear, and strong enough to turn even the darkest story into one worth living.